Hello, everyone. I'm David Hattner. I'm the conductor of the Portland Youth Philharmonic, and I'm really anxious to get started this week because I'm seeing two old friends who have a combined knowledge that will be fascinating to discuss, especially with the music that we have this week, which is quite varied. Uh, First, we have Jennifer Arnold, who until recently played the viola in the Oregon Symphony and is currently the director of artistic programming and also orchestral operations at the Richmond Symphony Orchestra in Virginia. And also Andy Grams, with whom I studied conducting at the Aspen Institute, and who is currently the music director of the Elgin Symphony in Illinois and also a prominent guest conductor of orchestras all around the world, including here with the Oregon Symphony, where he did a brilliant program a couple of seasons ago. And let's welcome them right now.
Hi.
Hello.
Nice to see you guys. We've already been chatting in the green room, so we're already warmed up. Jen, what was the last program you played in Richmond before everything came to a halt? Do you remember?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had a kids show with the Richmond, the School of Richmond Ballet, and our now music director designate, Valentina Pileggi. It was Appalachian Spring, a program for the Richmond young people, so school concerts.
Excellent. So what about you, Andy? Where were you and what were you conducting?
I actually had 2 weeks in Spain, of all places, right before everything went down. I was with the orchestra in Oviedo, and we did subscription concerts there the first week, and then the second week we went and participated in the Bilbao Festival, where we played, what did we do? Oh, Debussy Printemps, Poulenc Organ Concerto, and Saint-Saëns Organ Symphony, and some other things that I can't remember.
It's a fantastic program, though.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. So Oboe d'Amore is always interesting in person, right? Never know exactly what's going to happen.
What's going to come out of the end.
So, one of the hardest things is to come up with a name for the program. So I just thought I would call it The Sound of an Orchestra because, at least at the time I was growing up and all the times before that, each great orchestra had its own sound and it was identifiable. And I think it will be interesting for people to sort of get into the minds of two very fine musicians who are players and one who's a player and a conductor on what occurs to you when you hear an unidentified orchestra or piece as to what are the elements that are going into creating the sonority. Because I think each of the examples, it's some different aspect of playing that's sort of creating the primary sound of these things. And you both are have studied or worked in Ohio, which is also where I'm from. Although you're from the side of the state that has the great orchestra, and I'm from Toledo, where they have a surprisingly decent orchestra.
They have a good orchestra.
So you've had some really great training and some great sounds in your ears, and also you've gotten to see how that particular brand of superior orchestra functions and how they work together. So why don't we hear a few seconds of the first track today, which is an arrangement of Wacht auf by Johann Sebastian Bach. So now you know why I like to send out the sound files beforehand. This broadcast does in no way justice to what that actually sounds like. You can find the link to these recordings in the description for those of you who are tuning in before listening, which is perfectly fine. So Jen, when you heard that sound go into your ears, what were the first things you thought?
I thought it sounded old school. What I think is old school, at least. A lot of vibrato, a lot of different positions going up the string. That's what I heard. A lot of vibrato. Oh, and to me, that reminds me of actually how I grew up studying, like and watching Cleveland Orchestra violinists go up and up and up and up, and those kind of things. So that's what reminded me. Lots of full sound, lots of full bow, and that's what I thought about. Lots of vibrato, full sound.
Yeah, I agree completely. It's you can tell that, like, when she's saying, going up the string instrument, she's staying on the lower strings up as far as you possibly reasonably can with a good sound. And it definitely sounds like the violins are trying to stay on the G string as much as possible. But for me, not just the string sound, but also when the winds took over that second part of the phrase, I liked how it seemed. It seemed like everybody had the same approach. So like you heard all the violins and the violas, they had the same approach to how they were going to execute, pulling sounds from their instruments. And then when the winds came in, it seemed like they also had a unanimity of how we're going to create this wind sound and how we're going to move the notes and support the notes all the way through.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. The word that comes to mind immediately when I hear that is sustained, which is a word I heard a lot in my clarinet lessons. And
real sustained.
But it's really continuous sound, like it's going around in a circle, never hesitates, and it's always just going. And the style of music making, Jen, I think is also very old-fashioned, with the slowing down at the ends of phrases, giving a lot of time, and also the kind of basic slow tempo of it in the first place. Has this arrangement come across either of your careers at any point?
Jen?
No, not playing wise. I've never played it. Of course, I've heard it, but
I've played, I think, other arrangements of Bach et Auf, but not this particular one. And I was wondering if it was Stokowski.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's his arrangement. Although I believe it's possible that this arrangement was done for this concert separately from the one that he published, because he has recordings of this that are different. I know he tinkered with them all the time, but yes, it is his arrangement. And does the orchestral? This is obviously a set group. They play too well together to be a pickup group. Any thoughts on who is doing the playing here?
I'm never going to be able to guess that. Never.
I wanted to go with Philly, but there's no way that it is.
Well, why would it not be?
Well, the first thing that came to mind was the quality of the recording, because I don't think that he recorded with them in the era that would have produced this kind of clarity of sound. Symphony of the Air? I don't know.
Well, you have to remember this is a live performance recording from a broadcast. So we might as well do the reveal and then talk a little bit more about it, because it is the Philadelphia Orchestra.
Okay.
From a return visit by Stokowski well into the Ormandy era, although I wanted to include this great Mahler 8 photo that you may have seen before from 1916. But starting in 1960, Stokowski came back every year for about 10 years, and they became the highlights of the season, because before 1960. He had last conducted in 1941.
Hmm.
So he was gone a long, long time. And every time he came to Philadelphia, the sound seemed to come back with him. So you can look at the next photo, which is more what he looked like at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have one more Philadelphia there. That's the classic Philadelphia pose with the fur collar and all that. So did it occur to either of you that there were no bowings, that it was free bowed based on the amount of sound?
I mean,
the amount of sustained, yeah.
That to me is definitely part of the old school style. You know, they're not talking about the bowings as much as we do now.
Yeah, that's
Free bow.
So yeah, and here's the interesting thing. I try to do free bowing, not like everywhere, but like in certain places and certain pieces, and with orchestras. Like, nobody wants to free bow today.
I'm a big fan of the free bow. Who is no one?
I love the free. So I became a big fan of the free bowing after I started playing again, after I had put it away for a while. So like, as I was telling you guys while we were chatting in the green room, this Mendelssohn octet that I was playing, you know, we'd be sitting down there rehearsing and whatnot. I'm sure that I was such a frustration on everybody, because they'd be like, "What bow are you doing there?" And I was like, "I have no idea."
The one that sounds good.
It depends on what I need right then. Sometimes I can't sustain, and I need to take an extra bow. Take an extra bow.
Yeah.
So when I was, I'm sorry, David.
No, go ahead, Jen.
I was just going to say, when we had free bowing moments in the Oregon Symphony, I love to look, especially if I'm further back. If I was further back, I would love to look and see what bow people were on and do the exact opposite, like right at that time. You gotta keep it interesting. Like, everybody's going, "Oh, it looks like it's going to be in sync. I got to be opposite." So I love it.
Yeah, there's somewhere on YouTube, there's a video of Stokowski rehearsing a German orchestra, one of the radio orchestras, I think, and trying to convince them to not bow together, which in Germany was an especially big problem, trying to get them to do that. But the thing that always strikes me about Stokowski is, like, it sounds like the Philadelphia Orchestra no matter what orchestra it is. And it's very consistent. And many of the musicians with whom I studied, including Robert Marcellus, who played for Stokowski a couple of times in Cleveland, said it was within 15 minutes of the beginning of the first rehearsal, the orchestra sound changed, but he wasn't saying anything or even doing anything in particular. It just happened. And then when he left, then it went away. But I think that's one of the reasons Sell liked having him, was it gave something to the orchestra that he couldn't get from them.
Yeah.
Have you seen videos of him conducting? There's nothing to see.
Well, there's nothing to see, I think, vertically in terms of dictation of time, but there's a lot to see horizontally. He was always about, and you, like you said, you hear it instantly. He was always pulling the sound. The sound was always horizontal.
Yeah, he's just beating really clear beats, which is not what you get from the sound. But it's very, I don't know if it's on YouTube or not, but he did the Haydn variations in Chicago, and if you don't watch the picture, it sounds just beautiful. You know, legato, sustain, but he's just beating it in four like crazy. He's just like wham, wham, boom, 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 and not particularly elegant, but none of that happens in the sound. He's just showing where the beats are, and it's quite one of the more arresting things. Is that he had this ability to just get orchestras to play.
But he had to be pretty detailed, right? I mean,
very
because if you listen to that, you hear the fact that it's sustain until it's not, right? Until the clear phrase marking, and so you have to be really detailed for that to happen, to get everyone to. Yeah,
I would say he was clear and efficient. Was basically how he was described to me. With that rehearsal was 100% business. He stopped. When he stopped, he almost basically kept his hands ready to go, and then he would call out where they were going to start, and the downbeat came within half a second of that. And often at the beginning of his time with an orchestra, the orchestra wouldn't be ready to play yet, and he would yell at them and say, "Don't waste my time. Be ready to play." And then he would save so much time by not having to wait for people to pick their instruments up. They had to keep them up. So it was like the ultimate professional. He could just get results everywhere.
Well, there. I know that there's like at least one, maybe two videos of him in a rehearsal, later in his life. But wouldn't it be fascinating to have documentation of, let's just say, like general rehearsals from like the first 5 years of his tenure in Philadelphia?
Yes.
Because you can only imagine that, like, it was probably very insistent, doggedly insistent, and just relentless in getting what it was that he is looking for, which is not necessarily something, at least from a string player's point of view, is the most natural thing to do, to sustain that, like, all the way through every down bow and every up bow unremittingly. It's something that doesn't happen very, very often in a lot of places.
That's true.
Yeah, but the solo playing back then was much more sustained in that time period.
The solo playing was.
So,
but you couldn't
it makes
necessarily
me wonder if that was, because I feel like back then, orchestral players did it all. They were playing more solo, they were playing more chamber, and it wasn't so. So I wonder if that's just part of the culture of what orchestras were back then.
That's hard to say. His instrument was the organ, so that is really where the concept of sound comes from. He wanted that kind of sustaining, but with much more expressivity. That's the one thing the organ doesn't have, is a lot of nuance, especially in between the notes. But you may know that the Philadelphia Orchestra, as we know it today, didn't exist when he took it over in 1912. It was a really part-time orchestra that rehearsed in German, and as he said, he only kept 3 of the players that he had when he went there, and everybody else came in and was sort of on 2 weeks' notice that he could fire them at any time if he found somebody he liked better. But he found these great solo players, and then by 1916 they did the Mahler 8th. So it's an astounding thing, and of course he stayed from 1912 to 1941, which is a good long tenure.
Insane.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
And it kind of defines what an American orchestra is in many ways. Them and also what happened in Boston as well.
Right.
Well, any final thoughts on it? But what about the piece, Jen? Can we still play this piece, or is it just so far from what we think of Bach being that it's dead?
Oh no, you can totally play this piece. And I think, I also grew up in like I said, like with old school kind of philosophy. Bach was always kind of like that. I don't know if you've heard about Cleveland Bach, but it's very vibrato, it's very sustained. It's not period, it's not, or what did they say? Now it's not period.
Historically informed.
Informed. Yeah. I'll say old school Cleveland. I don't know.
Old school. I like,
but old school Cleveland. If I didn't vibrate in Bach and sustain, I would get that wasn't the way I was trained. Now
Andy, have you done any of Stokowski's Bach ever on your programs?
You know what? Actually, only once, and fortunately, it was with the Cleveland Orchestra, and it was the famous Toccata and Fugue, which was a lot of fun.
I would bet.
But actually, to get to what your question about could we do this today, I think that we could play the piece today. I'm not sure that we could do it at that tempo.
It's a good point.
Why?
Hold on 1 second. I'm in my basement. It's dry down here. That's nasty. Why do I say that? I think it's a mixture of two things. Number one, I think that people's brains process sensory information so much faster that they're looking for the next thing, the next note, the next whatever, in a certain way, at a certain speed. It's like, keep giving it to me, keep giving it to me. I get where you're going, keep giving it to me. And then the second thing is getting that level of sostenuto is extremely difficult to get, especially over the course of so long of a piece. You might be able to start that way at the beginning, but it's very difficult to really sustain it all the way through. It's kind of like, let's just say that people can sustain a level of physical exertion to run a 5K, but to be able to run a marathon requires a sostenuto of exertion. And that's something that not everybody can actually execute. No.
Well, I recommend to both of you to look into the Stokowski catalog. There are many, many arrangements, and not just of Bach, although that's probably the primary composer. There are some interesting piano works of Tchaikovsky that he transcribed that no one has done in probably since he died. And they're really, nice pieces. I don't think maybe one of the proteges of his that has made some records has done the Bach Chaconne for violin arranged for orchestra that he did. That's an awfully long piece, but it is fascinating to hear.
My personal Stokowski favorite is Purcell's Deidel's Lament.
Yeah,
that's a great arrangement.
Yeah, it's again like not historically informed, but it's very beautiful. Yeah, quite remarkable. Should we move on to Beethoven, the one standard work, because this performance, its defining characteristics are very, very different. So can we hear about the beginning of this one? I'm going to start it with you again, Jen, because that's your
like waiting for the next note.
Yeah, that's your home section there.
What did I think about for sound? Is that what we're talking about?
Just what it doesn't have to be sound. Just what strikes you in this performance?
For me, when I was listening to it, was tempo. I like the tempo. For me, that there's something about that movement that maybe it's the many times I've played it. I don't like it when it's too slow, personally. So for me, it was tempo and phrasing. I don't know. When I was listening to it, I could use a little bit more of a certain viola line that I didn't hear, but that was just me personally. But I mean, I liked it, the sound. Yeah.
Andy?
There were a couple of things that jumped out at me. The first was the opening wind chord. What I really liked was that it started out really out of tune, but then everybody adjusted as quickly as they could.
Yeah.
And so that tells me that this is an orchestra where everybody can recognize when something's not right and then do what they need to do individually to bring it together. And then I also agree with Jen, the tempo is great. And I think part of the reason why the tempo works is that the 2/8 notes with the 2 dots and a slur over the top are not too short, but they're not too long. There's a certain insistence to that rhythm that keeps the line going forward. And having the having the great fortune of being able to conduct this with a number of different orchestras, this movement is way harder than it should be or seems like it would be. And so having that tempo start and then more or less stay that way through the course of the whole recorded movement is quite a good feat.
Yeah, what strikes me about the playing is the articulation in this movement. It's very consistent and it's really clear, and it's clear something that's part of the culture, and it fits this conception of this movement really well. And yeah, the tempo is very consistent. It's a little under what's marked, but it's quite a bit over what often was done this long ago.
Yeah, or currently. I played it.
Oh,
sometimes it can go on for a long.
It can go on. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a video of Klemperer on YouTube doing this, and it's somewhere around 50 or something like that. It's very, very slow, and I simply cannot hear it that way anymore. You know, having seen David Zinman do it at the marked tempo and others, this strikes me as like it's quite modern sounding for when it was done. Any thoughts about the other characteristics that you hear and where this sort of playing might have originated?
Oh, I'll never win this game.
I'm.
What about the vibrato? Let's talk about that.
Well,
or lack thereof.
Lack thereof. I mean, for me, it's not really a classical style of playing, but like it's in between. I don't know. I mean, coming from Oregon, we played Beethoven with very, very little vibrato for so long that like I've gotten used to it with a lot less vibrato and much more dynamics, bringing out, you know, the line. But this, to me, the reason I brought up the tempo also, because I think the tempo is what brings out a lot of the specifics. Like there's a part later where the triplets, or maybe it's probably sextuplets, it's just the tempo just makes it flow musically. I don't know. The other thing for me was the phrasing, actually. I always think about this opening, you know, is it a 4-bar phrase? Is it 2-bar phrases? Is it 1 bar? You know, it's that kind of thing. And I feel like it was very clear what the phrasing was. I don't know if I agreed with it, but it was very clear. So
I agree with you. Yeah, I thought the phrasing was well defined.
Yeah.
So would both of you agree that, like the Stokowski recording that we just heard, there's a unanimity of everybody playing knew exactly what everybody else was going to be doing?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, wait a second. Yes, for the most part. I think this is the one, if I had to listen to it again, though, some people were longer in certain areas later on. I don't think it was always unified. Is that recording? Yeah, I think so.
It could be this one. And then
there were some string players hanging out a little bit.
I would only assume that they received some stern glances from the podium.
Yeah, recording was very stressful back then. So
I know, that's why I love old school recordings. It was just different. It was just playing, you know.
Well, and so just to mention a thing about the dynamic markings in the score and their the relative lack of that detail in this particular performance, I wonder how much of that is because of the limitations of the recording technology back then. Mm. So like the very, very end of the movement has all of these subito dynamic markings that you don't get on this recording, which makes you wonder, oh, well, they're not doing it. Well, maybe they did do it, but they couldn't capture it.
Right. Yeah, this recording being well over 80 years old, there were certain things that simply technically could not be done. One of which was the timpani could not play out. It would simply, the playback equipment could not track that. So they barely had timpani on old recordings. And the other thing is that the softs would be brought up and the louds would be tempered just to some degree, because eventually, once the record started to be worn, softs were inaudible under the surface noise. So that would have been to some degree altered, I would say.
Yeah.
Well, what I love about this recording is it reminds me of the recordings that I grew up with, that you could hear the individual violist or the individual cellist. And so, like, that's what I loved about this. I love that. I think it's great.
So, Andy, what about the string vibrato? Did you hear any?
It didn't stand out to me. I have to admit that I wasn't paying that close of attention to the string vibrato per se. I like what I was saying about the 2/8 notes, everybody seems to be definitely going up in the generally the same level of markation of each of those particular notes. But in terms of left hand use, I didn't really notice that much. If I think from the opening, as the layers get built up on top of each other, and so let's say, well, the point where the basses go yum, bum, bum, yum, bum, 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 you can definitely hear the bass line, but it doesn't sound like they're, giving a couple of shakes. It sounds a little bit more pure to me, rather than what today you would hear the basses really going into that bum, bum, bum. They would really round out the beginning and the ends of those notes with a number of shakes in between. But here they seem to keep it pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it sounds very classical to me. Any final thoughts, Andy, on based on your knowledge of conducting and conductors and orchestras? That doesn't have to be a specific guess, but your impression of what orchestras might have played this way.
I mean,
See, this is the one I would have guessed Philly, actually. I
You
would have guessed
Philly?
the other one. Only because of how the old school recordings I had, where it's Philly, it felt like, but I can't tell you the sound thing with orchestra. I know one orchestra.
I don't know.
Maybe two.
I wanna go with like East Coast.
Uh-oh, there's a smile.
In maybe the late 40s, early 50s. I could be way off. I don't know.
Remember, we're talking about the 30s.
This is you said over 80 years. That's
this is
true.
the 30s. We didn't talk at all about the wind playing, but I would point out that none of the winds are vibrating, including the flute.
Yeah, they did keep it straight.
So there's no point in drawing out the drama.
Yeah.
This is not American, but it is in fact the Vienna Philharmonic with Felix Weingartner.
Hey.
The first conductor to record all the Beethoven symphonies, actually.
Okay.
And there's a great photo on the next slide of very young Felix Weingartner. Like, incredible photo because he started his conducting career when he was 20 or 21 years old. He's one of the most remarkable musicians people don't know much about. You could show the last one, which is a more typical. That looks more like Weingartner, because he was a great pianist. He studied with Liszt, actually, and was sort of around for a lot of great things, and was, of course, the director of the Vienna Opera directly following Mahler, and wrote a book about Beethoven symphonies. I don't know if you've ever read it. It's very interesting, and a lot of it still holds.
Weingartner is a very, very interesting musician. I remember thinking to myself this afternoon when I was just going over the playlist again, I wondered if it was the Vienna Philharmonic, and then I thought to myself, it doesn't sound like they've tuned high enough for it to be them. And so I
actually checked it because it seemed way too high to me, and it's like 446 on the dot. It's right there.
Okay. Wow.
And it is recorded in the Musikverein. But it's interesting because most of the one generation younger German, Austrian conductors were doing very slow, very personalized, what we call non-classical Beethoven by this point, and he's much closer to Toscanini, although they probably barely ever met, and came to certain similar conclusions. But yeah, the string sound is very pure compared to, like, say, what Philly or Boston would do in terms of the depth of vibrato and the richness of sound. It's very interesting. So, and I recommend, he also recorded all the Brahms symphonies. Some of those were done in England, some of the Beethoven as well. But it's interesting to hear it from someone who met Brahms and worked with him, and very interesting. And his recordings just aren't that well known in the United States. They're hard to find, but I think most of them are on YouTube somewhere nowadays.
You can find, and this is the great thing about the age that we live in today, is that you can find, I mean, they might not be in the highest quality, but you can find just about anything out there. And it never ceases to amaze me just how close these composers that we think are so old and ancient actually are to us. I mean, with this recording, my mom was 2 when this recording was done. So, you know, Weingartner and Brahms and those guys weren't that far gone.
Right now.
They're not as far as we think they are.
Right. This was Weingartner. I think he died in 1940. So this was toward the end of his career, but it's just so great that they said, well, let's record all of the Beethoven symphonies with one conductor. It had never been done before, and they're very interesting. And also, there's a lot of talk about that particular orchestra, Vienna Philharmonic, and its tradition. But this is one of the few recordings that actually represents that, because 2 years later, a third of the orchestra, all the Jewish musicians, were kicked out, and tradition didn't seem to count for so much then. And when they they were never quite the same. They played very differently as personnel changed, and we'll talk a little bit more about that with our next selection, which obviously comes from the music anyway, comes from Vienna. And let's have a little spot in here that we can hear. There we go. So that's a very particular style of music. Why don't we start with Andy this time, because I know it's an area of repertoire that you have a lot of feelings about.
I do. I love I love waltzes and polkas. I just adore them, and they are the most fun of all the things to conduct purely from a physicality standpoint. They are just so much fun, especially if you are able to do them with that degree of flexibility of time and lilt and grace, and that's the best stuff. And more importantly, and I think that, like, we need it in the time that we're all living in right now, it's stuff that just puts a smile on your face. And sometimes you just need music to put a smile on your face.
Jen, any thoughts?
I was dreading this question. I do not like waltzes. I don't enjoy them at all. I don't.
Because you don't like sitting there going.
I don't enjoy them. I like polkas though. Polkas are fun. Yeah, that's all I was gonna say.
Is it that, do you not like them, or do you not like playing them?
I don't like playing them. I don't really enjoy listening to them.
It's green eggs and ham to you. I understand.
It's not my thing. Never has been.
There was, back when I was a violinist in the New York City Ballet Orchestra, there was one of George Balanchine's ballets. I'm pretty sure it was called Tales from the Vienna Woods, and it was you know, it was a long ballet that was made up of different Strauss waltzes. And I was in the second violins, and I was the only guy sitting there like, bump, 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 having the time of my life. It was so much fun.
Yeah, I don't feel it.
Yeah, I never played that many of them, and I think the only one I've conducted is the Schoenberg reduction of the Emperor Waltz. I remember doing that at some point. And yeah, they are very difficult. They're very difficult. But they require all of your musicianship if they're going to sound or feel like anything. And they're part of a tradition that's I don't know that 21st century American musicians what it would take to fully inhabit this world, sound world and pulse world.
Well, I have some theories on that. I mean, one of the reasons why we don't have I think that when we use the word tradition, what we're talking about is familiarity. And when it comes to pieces like these waltzes and polkas, generally speaking, they are on some sort of popular concert that gets one, maybe two rehearsals. And more often than not, if people are not familiar with them, they think that they're easy and they don't have to work on them, or they don't have to familiarize themselves with them. And then they quickly realize in the rehearsal that, oh, actually, it requires a lot of concentration all the time. And most importantly, from a conductor's point of view, it requires extremely clearly marked parts. Because when it comes to all the repeats and the DSs and where do you go from this point to that point, on these parts that have been marked differently for over 80 years with different conductors wanting different things, and they take time here but not here, but then another conductor will take time here but not there. You have to have a very, very clear roadmap for the musicians to work from. And then you can start to rehearse and get everybody familiar with each of these individual waltzes that require very, very different things depending on what the topic is.
Yes, this was something that my teachers, who when I was in school were old school, never failed to mention on occasion, was like, don't go to rehearsal of those without looking at them, because you will be lost. You know, the parts are not very clear. They're very basic, and the roadmap is extremely complex. And you don't want to be the one who's just joined the orchestra, doesn't know what's going on, because everyone else will know all this stuff. I don't know if they still know all this stuff the way they did 70 years ago, but there's just a lot to know. And also the manner in which the inner parts of these rhythms are interpreted has evolved a little bit. Do you have theories on the placement of beats within the bar, Andy? Because I have some very definite theories about it.
I would love to hear your theories. To me, it's one of those things where, like, you know it's right when you hear it, but you can't necessarily really describe it. But one of the conductors, again, back at the New York City Ballet, would say that the perfect second quarter in a 3/4 bar comes after the third quarter.
Yeah. It's a feeling, though. You have to feel those, 2 and 3. I think it's definitely a feeling.
And the 2 and 3 is not always the same, even within
within the bar, right? And it's the same kind of feeling that you get, like, that you start to realize in other types of genres of music as well that you play in orchestras. It's the same thing when they teach you, like, when you're younger, that a certain, like, swinging is like the da 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 da, and then you realize it's not like that at all when you're in orchestra. It's definitely, you have to feel the beat and you have to feel the groove. So it's the same thing with the waltz. I mean, no da da, it's the same. So
Well, I've studied a lot of recordings of these. We've spent a lot of time recently, but tried to go back to the oldest Vienna Philharmonic recordings I can find, and then and really like what's going on with the pulse and the rhythm. And what I've observed is that this sort of distortion of the second and third beats becomes more pronounced the slower the tempo is, and the faster it goes, the less pronounced it is until it eventually disappears completely. So it's always evolving, even within one phrase, as the tempo moves toward the center and moves a little faster, and then at the end of the phrase, as it pulls back, it changes. So it's an entire culture of put into 8 bars, and that's, it's amazing to hear when it's conveyed to an orchestra that is not born and bred in the tradition of that. That's when you hear somebody who can get this from an orchestra that's not in Central Europe. It's like, wow, that's an astounding achievement, and I think it would be even more astounding now to hear something that resembles what you're hearing here. So Andy, you had some thoughts on who might be performing this before we even started this thing.
I really think it's Eric Kleiber.
Jen, you probably don't have any.
Could be wrong.
I have zero idea about this. It's like, no, I will not win. I won't get one right. Not one.
I will say this, Andy, if I heard this in the same manner you did, I would say exactly the same thing.
Okay, but it's not.
Because the culture of the music making is so sophisticated and so beautiful. And, I don't list conductors in an order of greatest or second greatest, but there's no one greater than Erich Kleiber. That's how high my esteem is for him. But who is doing the playing?
You can do this, Andy.
Was it Berlin?
Are you convinced it's done in Europe?
Uh-oh.
Oh boy.
One of the reasons I chose this waltz is it doesn't have any solos that would sort of, particularly from the winds, that would sort of tell you, oh, that sound comes from.
Exactly. You know what? I'm not sure. I'll say this. What made me convinced that it was Eric Kleiber is that it was extremely flexible, yet rigidly controlled at the same time.
Yeah. Yes, I agree with you. And the conductor who it actually is in many ways the closest to Eric Kleiber of all the other great conductors of the world. So we can throw the slide up because.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And amazingly, this is a Pennsylvania orchestra that is not the Philadelphia Orchestra. And so that's the reason I chose it, is like to bring this. Of course, the Pittsburgh Symphony probably had a lot of European musicians in it, and some recent Curtis grads as well, no doubt. But to be able to bring this sound culture to this orchestra, it's really quite remarkable. There's good old Fritz. Is there another picture that goes online?
Wait, before you do that, I love it says the Pittsburgh Symphony is available for tour engagement.
Yeah, this is their from their manager, I guess. Yeah.
That's awesome.
And this photo, which is really a remarkable photo that I found, this is contralto Carol Bryce, who sang and recorded with the Pittsburgh Symphony. She recorded the Songs of a Wayfarer of Gustav Mahler and Defias Elamor Brujo. You can hear both of these on YouTube, but this is a very remarkable photo for its time for a lot of reasons, as you can imagine. And of course, Fritz Reiner also gave Leontine Price an early start when he recorded the Verdi Requiem with her. And he was a remarkable man. And I think one of, on a very, very short list of the greatest conductors who ever lived. And he showed that in a number of different places. But if you hear his recordings from Pittsburgh, it's hard to come to any other conclusion that he was a miracle worker, although we're led to understand that some of those miracles came at great cost to the mental health of the players on stage.
That I can believe.
Yeah.
what amazes me a little bit more about this, about it being Reiner and not Kleiber, although both of them were, of course, authoritarians, but you don't necessarily think of Reiner as being that that indulgent in terms of tempo flexibility and whatnot, because there were many times in this particular recording where I was like, "Ooh, boy, you're stretching that way out," and I could see an Eric doing that, but I would never think of it. Reiner would not come to me to be that making an Ausgang before an Eingang.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Well, he did this music a lot. One of my professors was his principal clarinet at the Chicago Symphony, and he said they did concerts of these regularly. They were popular concerts, and that he would sort of take the opportunity to really expand and try things in concerts. And he said there was just one time where he got so far out that the orchestra was lost a little bit for a few seconds, and they just all stopped playing. And he just raised his eyebrows and started conducting again, and they all started playing again. But that they also sort of recognized, well, that's as far as it can go, I guess. But he was a spontaneous person in concerts and would try things that, of course, had been very well drilled. And he had the orchestra on a short leash, but that allowed him to take them great distances. But yes, his Pittsburgh legacy, which I think is fairly well represented on YouTube. I don't know if the Don Juan is on YouTube, but if you can find it, it's one of the more extraordinary performances of that piece. And he did some pretty good ones in Chicago too. But the Pittsburgh one it's on another level. It's quite remarkable. And the first recording of Shostakovich Sixth was done in Pittsburgh with him.
I love
a few
that.
other things.
I grew up with that recording. I love that recording.
It's pretty
amazing.
good.
Yeah.
That's
how I fell in love with that symphony.
So, and of course, you're a conducting graduate of the Curtis Institute, so there's some legacy there as well.
I suppose.
He even had a female student for a time in that class, which is another sort of extraordinary thing. I don't believe she graduated, but at least she got in.
At least she got
yeah. He only gave an A to one student in 10 years.
It couldn't have been Bernstein.
Of course, it's Bernstein. They got along pretty well, all things considered, except for I'm reading Bernstein's letters right now, and he wanted to leave Curtis and move to Boston and work with Kuzovitsky after a summer at Tanglewood, and the Curtis Institute threatened the Boston Symphony that they would never send another student to Tanglewood again if Bernstein didn't return for his second year of conducting lessons. So, but yeah, if Bernstein had Reiner to Pittsburgh to conduct his Jeremiah Symphony, and Bernstein had Reiner to New York to conduct concerts with the New York Philharmonic. So they remained in reasonably good relationship, as much as anyone did with Fritz Reiner. So, shall we talk about the last track a little bit? Let's hear a few seconds of that. Well, there we go. It gets better as it goes along. Actually, I think that in this performance, Jen, any thoughts on hearing this arrangement and performance?
I mean, my first thought was it was a shred. I love that.
Yeah.
People are shredding away.
That's the violins are going at it. You don't need any of the other instruments of the orchestra for rehearsals. Great.
Exactly. Just play all the right notes in the right part of the bow, and yeah, shred. Love it. My kind of piece.
I love the arrangement too. It's got inside information for the audience, the knowledgeable audience, right?
Mm-hmm.
With its
I especially love the Beethoven 3 I passed around. I really can't wait for the reveal of this, because this is quite fun.
Yeah. There's really no way to know. There's a long list of orchestras where that it couldn't be, just because they weren't at the level necessary to do it. But we can probably do an early reveal on this one, because it is sort of an extraordinary and unusual thing. If you want to put the slide up there. There we are. Most people don't realize the Chicago Symphony existed before Fritz Reiner, but it certainly did.
Oh, yes, very much so.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have a few more pictures of Dr. Stock. Yes, there, there we go. The longest serving music director in the orchestra's history, actually, because he was a member of the orchestra, playing in the viola section under Theodore Thomas, who founded the orchestra. And then Theodore Thomas died in 1905 in the middle of the season, and Stock was the interim. He had been the assistant conductor also, and started conducting. And by the time they were ready to bring in guest conductors, he had become popular with both the orchestra and the audience. So they kept him there, and he stayed until 1942 when he passed away. But obviously, he was also a composer, and he knew some things, and made some very interesting recordings, because he actually had seen Brahms conduct in Germany. His recording of the Brahms Third, I think it's something everyone should hear, because when the Third Symphony of Brahms was new, some critics called it Brahms's Eroica Symphony. No one thinks about it in those terms now. They think of it as his pastoral symphony. And when you hear Stock's recording, it's like, oh wait, maybe that makes sense. So I recommend it to you.
Huh.
It's very alive and fast.
What? Like Jen was saying, it's just a shred, and you can tell that all of the violinists, it's probably firsts and seconds, going to town on this moto perpetuo.
Yeah.
And they just, like, for however long the recording lasts, they all practiced and were able to deliver.
Right.
It reminded
like that are fun.
Yes, they can be. They can be fun, as long as everybody.
They should be
as long
fun.
as everybody, it can be fun as long as everybody, is able to step up, and that's what makes it, something like this, because this isn't a doctored recording.
Right.
Those people sat down, they started, and they played all of those notes together until the very end, and that is difficult to do, really difficult. And this particular recording reminded me of a set of other recordings that were introduced to me by my friend Fred Slatkin in New York. He's the brother of Leonard Slatkin, and their father, Felix Slatkin, was out in Hollywood back in the day, and there was this series of recordings that he would make with sometimes he would call them Felix's Fiddles or something like this.
Hollywood Bowl Symphony, something.
Hollywood Bowl Symphony. There were all these names, and there was this one particular disc. Oh, I can't remember the name, but it was like sort of hi-fi popular arrangements of like the great symphony orchestra. To like, there's this great arrangement of like the main theme from Tchaikovsky, third movement of Pathetique. And then there's this other one that has Zappateado of Sarasate, with all the violins playing like the actual thing. And they're all, and Fred, who was, my friend Fred was, a young guy at the time, and he was at his dad's recording sessions. And he was like, all these cats would come in, they would sight read what they were doing, they would play it through once, and then they would record it, and that was it. And it sounds amazing. And talk about shred. They would just lay these things down.
Yeah. But yeah, in the case of this, I imagine that it was in the orchestra's book constantly, and when they did their little bus tours, they probably played it as an encore several times a year, and so they finally just they needed the reason we call records albums is because they actually were albums. You'd have like 4 discs or 5 for a symphony, and sometimes the last side was empty, so you needed 4 minutes of music to fill up that side, and so there's like, oh, let's play this. We know it, and so it got recorded.
Yeah. No, it's a great example of orchestral discipline, and specifically section discipline.
Yeah, and I only know of one other version of an orchestra doing this, although I'm sure there are others. Toscanini recorded this as well, and it's quite different. It's more brilliant. The phrasing is very Italianate, and of course he did his own orchestration. But I recommend that to you. It's dazzling, of course, as you might imagine. Everything he did was.
With NBC, yeah.
Yes, NBC Symphony. Yeah,
okay.
which was an orchestra filled with concert masters anyway, because you had Mishakov and Oskar Shumsky and Joseph Gingold and various other characters in there that they could all play a little. So it was a. But yeah, I would love to hear. I mean, geez, contemporary orchestras, they all should have the chops to pull something like this off. Although it'd be a hard week's work.
Oh, the talent is there, and you can lay it down.
You can do it.
You just need everybody to sign up. That's all.
Yeah, you can do it. I mean, that's not anything. That's not anything harder than some of the new music that gets put in front of you. That can be very demanding. So
yes, indeed.
At least this is scales, and like this stuff falls into your fingers. Yeah.
So any last thoughts, Andy, before we wrap this up?
Oh, just that I love these types of things where you're able to discuss what people hear when they listen to the same thing, and I think that's a great sort of jumping off point for discussion, because when it comes to recordings or even live performances, there are certain elements that I think everybody needs to always take into account when they are conversing with people about what it is that they hear. One is, let's just say you're in the hall. Well, where were you sitting? Which night was it? Were you at the same performance? If you're listening to a recording, okay, is it the same recording? Yes. Was it recorded at a certain quality? Are you listening to it on the speakers on your iPhone, or are you listening to it with headphones? What kind of headphones? I mean, there are so many variables that go into this sort of thing. And then in the case of music professionals like us, well, what are you particularly tuning into? What grabs your attention right off the bat? And it's different for everybody. So these types of discussions, I think, are really, really, really interesting for people to perhaps take with them as they listen to their recordings that they love.
That's great, Jen.
This process, actually, I learned something during this process listening to these recordings. I have to say, I never really I listen to recordings all the time, but I never really pay attention to the orchestral sound, actually. I just am like, oh, do I like that phrasing? Do I, do those things work for me? I never listen to or does it tell does the performance of the work seem compelling? Those kind of things. But I never listen to the actual sound making of the orchestra. I never focused on that. So for me, I now want to go back and start listening to some of these recordings and thinking, oh, thinking, oh, that's a great string texture there. That's a great brass sound, or those kind of things. So for me, this was more of a learning process, because I just never do. I do that I do, however, like I can recognize individual playing. Like if we did this about violinists, I could be like, that was, that one, blah, blah, blah. But I never do that for orchestras, really. So this has been really interesting.
Yeah, when you listen to soloists, it's like listening to pop singers or opera singers. Like they have a timbre that's unique to them. For instrumentals, you're still operating an apparatus of some sort, so there's still that in between. But you cannot really mistake Misha Elman or Heifetz for anybody else, and certainly not for each other, although they might play the same piece. And orchestras were very much like this. For a long time, and then conductors started doing fewer weeks, and more generic halls got built that don't have a much character. Like in the Academy of Music had a very definite character. Now they're in this Verizon, which there's nothing wrong with it, but it's not really any different from any place else in any particular way. The New York Philharmonic went from Carnegie Hall to where they are now, and that changed the orchestra. It's not this. They have to produce sound differently. It seems like Cleveland and Boston were the lucky ones. They've gotten to be in one space for 100 years or more, and to develop a very particular thing that's very special. And although it's evolved, especially if you hear the Boston Symphony from this time we're talking about, you'd say, Jesus, don't the brass ever play loud? And the answer is no, they don't. Not what we call loud now, because it wasn't necessary, and it allowed the other sections to cultivate something that was very special because they were not drowned out all the time. So, and I miss being able to turn on the radio and hear a recording and be like, that's got to be this. I could never anything recorded in the last 15 years. I have no idea what it is. It's hard to tell.
Well, it's very the recording industry and performance expectations have sort of driven a lot of music making to a middle zone. Taking risks is not necessarily encouraged, at least from like a career building point of view. And so, if you have some, but also the thing is that when you're playing music from 80, 90, 100, 150 years ago, and it's been recorded already umpteen number of times, how new or how crazy can you be with it? So it's a very difficult thing to record today.
Yes, because I think it would be interesting if someone were to, let's say, recreate, just for the sake of doing it, Frederick Stock's way with the Brahms Third Symphony, and then play it for a modern audience, and their eyes would pop out, be like, that it'd be shocking, except that he lived in Brahms's era and was around and saw it firsthand. And it's like, this is what we've evolved into. So we can continue this in the green room a little bit, but it's probably time to put a wrap on this. So let me just wrap this up, and I'll see you backstage, so to speak.
All right.
Thank you, everyone, for watching this chat. It's been it's always great to reconnect with people you admire, and I admire both Jen and Andy so much, and they're such fine musicians. And I hope that you get a chance to listen to this playlist if you didn't already before you saw this. The Portland Youth Philharmonic, subscribe to our page if you're interested in what we do as an orchestra, because I think it's also very interesting. This Saturday, we're going to premiere yet another recent performance video, some selections from the Carmen suites of Georges Bizet, which we played last December. And it's a short segment, and we had a lot of fun with it. So that'll be this Saturday morning at 10 Pacific time. Next week, it's going to be a really interesting discussion. We're going to listen to some historic recording of classical singers. And we have a phenomenal panel with conductor Imre Palo, whose father was a famous baritone in Hungary, And Hannah Penn, who sang Voices of Light with the Portland Youth Philharmonic and who is a well-regarded mezzo here in the Portland area, and also Christina Peer, well-traveled and recorded soprano. So we're going to hear 5 recordings, which will be posted soon. One of each voice type, two different sopranos that couldn't be more different from each other. I think you will find these recordings most fascinating, and it will be wonderful to have that discussion. I will certainly learn a lot because that's one of the areas of music making I know so little about. In the meantime, stay safe, be healthy, and have a wonderful week.